Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into my Week 17 edition of my top starts and sits for the championship week of the fantasy football season. Congratulations if you did make it to your championship game. But as I told you guys all year, my top starts and sits, if you did not make your championship game, you can still apply this information to your daily lineups if you guys do play like I do. Or you can do something that I do as well. I take the stats I give out and I apply that when I bet on players overs and unders. So there's still ways you can win money if you did unfortunately miss your championship game. I am actually trying to get this out to you guys a lot earlier than normal. I'm obviously visiting my parents with a different background. Got a friend's holiday party tonight that I'm going to, so I'm trying to hopefully get this uploaded in time. I might have to upload it tomorrow depending on when I go leave to join my friends. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and dive into today's video, starting where we always do at the quarterback position. My top start of the week, I am going to go with Dak Prescott against the Commanders. That game is on Christmas, even though it's kind of a rough matchup if you want to take time from your family to watch the Cowboys and Commanders play. But it would be worth it for Dak Prescott managers. The Commanders have allowed they're tied for the second most allowed points per game against the quarterback position this season. When you look at the Prescott, his last three times that he's played the Commanders, he's finished in each of those three games with 260 plus passing yards and at least 3 touchdowns in his last 3 games against Washington. And then you look at the last 4 games from the Washington defense, 2 different quarterbacks finished with at least 245 passing yards against them, and they've also given up 8 passing touchdowns in their last 4 games. My other top start, I like the Drake May to continue his great sophomore season against the Jets. Jets have allowed the 7th most points per game against quarterbacks this season. When these teams first met this year, May threw for 281 passing yards, only got 1 touchdown, but still he almost had a 300-yard performance. And I like the chances he gets a pair of touchdowns at least in this game. When you look at the last 4 games from the Jets, 3 different quarterbacks finished with at least 230 passing yards against them, and they've given up 9 passing touchdowns in their last 4 games. Moving into my sits, these would be probably some streaming options for people to consider, maybe if they lost Mahomes entering the championship game. But these would be 2 ones I would look to avoid this week. My top sit, CJ Stroud against the Chargers. Chargers have allowed the 3rd fewest points per game against the quarterback position this season. When you look at their last 4 games, only 2 quarterbacks finished over 190 passing yards against them, and they've only given up 4 passing touchdowns in their last 4 outings. And then my other sit is Aaron Rodgers against the Browns. Now, Rodgers actually did have a good first game against them earlier this season. I think he finished over 250 passing yards. I know he had a pair of touchdowns. But my biggest factor that I decided to list him, even though he had a first good outing against them, is that he has no DK Metcalf, so he will be without his top pass catcher. And then he does have a tough matchup going against the Browns defense, who have allowed the 4th fewest points per game against the quarterback position. When you look at the Cleveland's last 4 games, there was only 1 quarterback that finished over 170 passing yards against them, and they've only given up 5 passing touchdowns in their last 4 games. Moving into the running back spot, my top start of the week, I like Chase Brown against the Cardinals. Cardinals have allowed the 3rd most points per game against running backs this season. In their last 4 games alone, there have been 5 different running backs that finished over 80 total yards against them, and they've also given up 6 running back touchdowns. My other start, he was a disappointment for most of his fantasy managers for most of the season, but Ashton Jeanty might have helped some of his managers win a championship this week, especially coming off that strong game against Houston. And I love this game for him against the Giants. New York is tied for the 4th most allowed points per game against running backs this season. When you look at their last 4 games, there have been at least 5 different running backs that finished with at least 80 total yards against them. But they've only given up 4 running back touchdowns their last 4 games, but given up a lot of production on the ground, and Genty's coming off his big time game for his manager, so I'm looking for him to continue that in the championship weekend. My top sits of the week, I am going to go with Rico Dowdle and Chuba Hubbard against the Seahawks. Seahawks are tied for the third fewest allowed points per game against the running back position. Now, there are only two running backs that finished over 75 rushing yards against Seattle in their last four games. Those running backs happen to be Bijan Robinson and Jonathan Taylor, guys that command the touches to help get them over that threshold. But obviously, Dowdle and Hubbard have been splitting the touches more as of late, so it'll be a guessing game which one of those guys might be able to cross that mark. And then why I also don't like the matchup is the Seahawks have only allowed one running back touchdown in their last four games. Moving into my other sits, I don't like the Chiefs pair of Chiefs running backs Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt against the Broncos. Biggest factor in this, besides the tough matchup, is Gardner Minshew is going to be not playing this game. I think it's going to be the guy that came in and filled in for Minshew, Chris Oladokun. So the fact that it's a third-string quarterback that didn't really look that great against the Titans this past week, what I expect the Broncos to do is load the box, stop the run, put them in a lot of third and long situations, and dare that quarterback to beat them. So I think that's going to take a lot of rushing lanes away from Pacheco and Hunt to get any type of yardage on the ground. And when you look at the matchup, Denver has allowed the fourth fewest points per game against running backs this season. In their last four games, there was only one running back to cross over 55 rushing yards against them, and they've only given up the 4 running back touchdowns in their last 4 outings. Moving into the wide receiver position. Coming off a pretty good game against my Colts last night, but I look for Jawan Jennings to have a good outing against the Chicago Bears this week. Chicago has allowed the third most points per game against wide receivers this season. When you do look at their last 4 games, 4 different wide receivers finished with with at least 80 receiving yards against Chicago, and then in those 4 games they've also given up 6 wide receiver touchdowns. My other star I do like Jacoby Myers and Brian Thomas Jr. against the Colts. I do want to bring up Parker Washington is a option maybe for more of a deeper league as a flex play. But if you do the daily lineups, I do like Parker Washington as a cheap option for the daily lineups this weekend. But either way, I do like all 3 wide receivers against the Colts. When you look at this matchup when the Colts and Jaguars played against each other a few weeks ago, Parker Washington didn't play in that game. But in that game, Brian Thomas Jr. finished with 3 receptions for 87 yards. And then Myers had 4 receptions for 39 yards, but all had that touchdown that made him have a solid outing. And then when you look at the last 4 games from the Colts, 3 different wide receivers finished with at least 85 receiving yards against them, and they've given up 5 wide receiver touchdowns in their last 4 games. Moving into my sits, my top sit of the week, I am going to go with Jameson Williams against the Vikings. Vikings have actually allowed the fewest points per game against the wide receiver position. When you look at Jameson Williams' career games against the Vikings, he's played Minnesota 5 times since got drafted by the Lions. In those 5 games, Jameson Williams has never finished over 70 receiving yards, and he only has 1 touchdown in the 5 career games against Minnesota. But then when you look at the Vikings' last 4 games, there has only been 1 wide receiver to finish over 45 receiving yards against them. If there's going to be a wide receiver that has a big day against this defense, I'm going to lean Amon-Ra St. Brown over Jameson Williams. And then they have also not given up a wide receiver touchdown in the last 4 games. It does feel like it's a boom or bust day if you leave Williams in your lineup. My other sits, I'm going to go with the trio of guys for Los Angeles: Ladd McConkey, Keenan Allen, and Quentin Johnston against the Texans. Texans are tied for the 2nd fewest allowed points per game against wide receivers this season. When you look at their last 4 games, only 1 wide receiver finished over 60 receiving yards. So the fact that any of these 3 guys could have that day is a guessing game at this point. So you just don't want to end up being on the wrong side of that. Then when you also look at the last 4 games, they've only given up 2 wide receiver touchdowns. So it feels like if you play one of these wide receivers, you got to hope he might be the guy that goes and gets 80 yards because it might become a touchdown or bust day for these wide receivers in Los Angeles. And then to wrap up this video, my top starts and sits. At the tight end spot, my top start, I like Jake Ferguson against the Commanders. Commanders have allowed the 3rd most points per game against tight ends this season. When these first 2 teams played earlier in this year, it's kind of an odd stat line, but Jake Ferguson had 7 receptions for 29 yards, but he had 2 touchdowns. in that matchup. When you look at the last 4 games from the Washington defense, 3 different tight ends they finished with at least 45 receiving yards, and they also gave up 4 tight end touchdowns as well. And then moving into my other top start, I was definitely wrong on him last week suggesting to sit, but I'm looking for him to have another good game. Harold Fannin Jr. against the Steelers. Steelers have allowed the 4th most points per game against the tight end position. When these teams first met way earlier in the season, I want to say it was back in October, Fannin Jr. actually had 7 receptions for 81 yards against them. When you look at the last 4 games from the Pittsburgh defense, there have been at least 3 different tight ends to finish with at least 40 receiving yards against them, and they've also given up 3 tight end touchdowns in their last 4 games. And then to wrap it up at the sits, my top sit of the week, I am going to go with Dalton Kincaid against the Eagles. Eagles have allowed the fewest points per game against tight ends this season. There was not one tight end that finished over 40 receiving yards against Philadelphia in their last 4 games. And when you look at the entire season, the Eagles have only given up 3 tight end touchdowns. And then I don't like either of the Ravens tight ends this weekend, Isaiah Likely or Mark Andrews against the Packers. It does sound like there's a potential that Lamar Jackson won't be playing in this game since he left this past game with an injury, and it already looked like he wasn't playing healthy as it is. So I'm leaning that Lamar is probably not going to be in that game, so that definitely factors in the potential ceiling for a Likely or an Andrews. And then when you look at the matchup, the Green Bay defense has allowed the 6th fewest points per game against tight ends this season. There was only 1 tight end that finished over 40 receiving yards against them in their last 4 games, and they've only given up 1 tight end touchdown in their last 4 games as well. So yeah, that wraps up this week's top starts and sits for week 17. I wish everyone the best of luck to go win yourself some championship and obviously a big payday depending on your league. I do want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays. I appreciate everybody watching along with these videos. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button. Make sure you do hit subscribe on the YouTube channel, and you can follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and X at Cody Talks NFL. So I'm gonna get off here and try to get this posted for you guys soon. But I did mention this in my waiver wire video. I do want to mention this in this video. Next week's schedule will be different. Again, if you're in a Week 18 championship game, please change that for next year. But I do understand I might have some listeners that are playing in Week 18 championship games. So I do plan on doing a start sits video next week combined with my streamable defenses. But that won't come out until like Friday or Saturday because there's no Thursday night game. They're all for the weekend. So I'll get it out sometime later in the week. So stay tuned for that. But I'll talk to you guys soon. Peace out.